Hi, my name is Adam, and today do simple goth makeup with me while I walk you through the ways psychological research has contributed to transphobic understandings of gender. However, this is only a small piece of a much bigger picture. As such, we will discuss how and why this information is important in our current times. First, why am I talking about this? I identify as transgender and am from the US, but very lucky to study in Canada. I'm currently in undergrad psychology and minoring in writing and communications. This is the final project for my research and marginalization course. In this video, we will be investigating some of the techniques used by cisgenderist researchers to shape the representation of trans identities. Cisgenderism refers to an ideology that delegitimizes people's own designations of their gender and bodies. What does that actually mean? To break it into smaller pieces, cisgenderism is the belief that being cisgender is the right or normal way to be, denying other people's autonomy in expressing their identity. This ideology has been prevalent in psychological research. Today, we will begin with a brief look into K.J. Zucker, a cisgenderist researcher, followed by a deeper analysis on 3 research articles he chose to cite in his 2012 piece, A Developmental Biopsychosocial Model for the Treatment of Children with Gender Identity Disorder. Those 3 being Sex Dimorphic Color Preference in Children with Gender Identity Disorder, a comparison to clinical and community controls by Chu et al., 2006. Psychosexual Outcome of Gender Dysphoric Children by Whalian and Cohn-Ketnes, 2008, and Gender Identity Disorder in Childhood, Inconclusive Advice to Parents by Dredger, 2009. Our approach to analysis will be heavily guided by previous works on cisgenderism, K.J. Zucker, and trans research. There's a few things we need to dissect before we get into the meat of it. If you're not my prof, you're probably wondering who the hell K.J. Zucker is and why he's important. Zucker is a psychologist with a long history of cisgenderism from research to application. He was fired from his head position at Toronto's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health due to allegations of conversion practices within the Gender Identity Service. He was previously named chair of the APA Work Group for Gender and Sexual Identity Disorders in the current Psychological Diagnostic Manual, or DSM-5. To name something a disorder creates a preconceived notion of it being wrong, abnormal, and fixable. All things trans identities are not. Gender identity disorder was in the DSM-4 and has been renamed to gender dysphoria. This reflects a shift in how distress, not identity, is being medicalized. That is crucial to understanding the harm we'll be unpacking, as the framing of trans identities as a disorder is a very common tactic we will see used in our analysis. Zucker's research is still being cited in debates about trans rights today, impacting current policy and opinion on trans people. The sources he cites legitimize their harmful research, and by pulling from similarly cisgenderist ideas, he is directly perpetuating their transphobic rhetoric. Of course, there's the articles that I am analyzing, all from the late 2000s, but let me read off some real articles that Zucker cited in the same paper. Play Activities of Normal and Effeminate Boys from 1973. Extreme Boyhood Femininity, Isolated Behavior or Pervasive Disorder from 1985. The Sissy Boy Syndrome and the Development of Homosexuality from 1987. And the list just goes on. That's references for one paper that came out in 2012. Similar to the papers we are looking at, these contain outdated and harmful information being used to study trans children. To closely examine the 3 articles we have today, I used qualitative coding to identify common themes and patterns. To give a very brief explanation, coding is a process of labeling and organizing non-numerical or qualitative data, such as interviews or field notes. I chose to use the program QDA MinorLite, but software isn't necessary to code qualitatively. I chose these articles specifically for their use of the term gender identity disorder. At the time, this term was considered diagnostically correct. However, medicalizing transness offers a discrete cover for transphobia, embedding harm into research through clinical neutrality. When trans experiences are portrayed as disordered, it can have damaging impacts on the way trans people are viewed. This is the predominant tactic in the Inconclusive Advice article. Dredger creates a fictional representation of a trans feminine child referred to primarily as the dead name, but occasionally with the chosen name of Julie. Dredger spins a complex narrative with a lot of moving pieces, using phrases such as insists or pretends he is a girl, even going so far as to say, "You now appear to have a daughter named Julie in a dress with a penis, insisting she's a girl," all to paint trans identities as a psychological issue. Dredger portrays these children as burdensome for their broken family, as from the perspective at the time, family dysfunction was described as a cause for trans identities. Further, the author presents it as something parents are expected to be disappointed, guilty, ashamed, and angry about. In the article, Sex Dimorphic Color Preferences, Chu et al. Have a different method of pathologizing transness than Dredger. While Dredger depicts a narrative of raising a burdensome and disordered trans child in a dysfunctional home, Chu et al. Take a more clinical approach, but it's no less dehumanizing. They do so by utilizing language that paints this clinical picture of transness, such as gender-referred and GID probands when discussing trans participants. Calling the participants gender-referred centers clinical intervention as opposed to personal identity, which is a subtle way to further pathologize transness. A proband is a term typically used in genetic studies to refer to the first family member to have the genetic disorder being studied. Combining it to be GID proband reduces the kids into disordered case studies, implicating their identity as a symptom. While pathologizing Page's transness as a medical problem, another tactic these authors use is gender essentialism, the belief that gender is fixed from birth. We see this demonstrated by both Chu et al. And Whalen and Cohen-Ketnes with their use of the terms cross-gender identification, positing the individual on one side of a binary scale, a tactic known as binarizing. Chu et al. Take this a step further by going so far as to describe a two-gender social world, an idea that meshes well with their concept of colors implicitly holding a gendered meaning because affect, a focus on the subjective internal world, is commonly associated with femininity, whereas nature, like a focus on the objective external world, is commonly associated with masculinity. Circling back to Whalen and Cohen-Ketnes' 2008 Psychosexual Outcomes article, their treatment of transness centers a desistance narrative. The idea they propose centers cisgender as a default, implying that most transgender children will be desisters as opposed to persisters. They insist on finding the truth behind a child's identity. Are they actually trans, or do they simply have to overcome their dysphoria? This perspective treats transness as a deviation to be tracked, not as an identity to be understood, further pushing the idea that transness is a mental disorder to be fixed. Instead, Whalen and Cohen-Ketnes posit that, quote, gender atypicality may precede the development of a homosexual identity, as opposed to a trans identity. In all three articles, the trans participants are discussed, theorized about, and dissected, but are never actually heard. There are no trans authors, no participant quotes, and no attempt to reflect the real lived experiences of these children. To purposefully exclude these important factors is narrative erasure. A way to combat this is with a common tool in trans studies research, autoethnography, a form of research that centers participant testimony as the main source of data and connects it to the researcher's personal experiences. It's very important in trans research specifically for its focus on experiential knowledge. To exclude trans voices is to write about us without us. The articles we've discussed have shown that harm is deeply impactful. This creates a system where cis people control the narrative, which becomes policy, practice, and public opinion. This reduces trans lives and experiences to something they must fit specific criteria for. The goal is not further support and understanding for the trans children in these studies, instead prioritizing a way to diagnose and fix their identities. The attacks on gender affirming care in the United States are not about science or whatever bullshit the government is saying to justify their ideological cleansing disguised as policy. This is about fascism. Fascism uses medicine to justify labeling certain groups as undesirable, marginalizing them in an attempt to exclude or eliminate them from society. The political assault on trans existence relies on research like the articles we analyzed today. The research K.J. Zucker has legitimized to justify its campaign of erasure. The United States is experiencing a fascist takeover. That is the blatant truth. To ignore or deny this reality is to be complicit in their regime. So, how can you stand up for trans rights in the face of such horror? If you're American, get involved. Call your legislators and be consistent. Overwhelm their email and voicemail with your concerns and stay informed about what bills are trying to be passed. Protest as much as you can, attend and organize local marches or demonstrations, and while I know the stock market is not doing great right now, boycotting still works. It gets the attention of big corporations and pressures them to act. Most importantly, do your research and stay informed. I'm aware the involvement I've described is a very general overview of all the things you can do to stand against the fascists in power. The best way to get involved is to be connected with people in your community who share your values and demonstrate to the government that you will not tolerate their deliberate efforts to erase trans people from the public eye. And here's our final look. As a trans person, this research was crushing to read. It was really hard to code for my project. The things they had to say really disgusted me, especially since it was all about vulnerable trans kids looking for gender-affirming care, trusting the researchers and clinicians to support and understand them. Psychological research is not about fixing. It's about learning and understanding. We are not a problem to be solved, and now is the time to stand up for that. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. This project has been difficult, and I deeply appreciate the time you've taken to listen to what I have to say. I wanted to give a special thank you to my wonderful professor, Marianne, and my genius classmates. I've been so lucky to sit in a room with all of you 3 times a week for the past 14-ish weeks. You're all delightful, and I'll miss you next term. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.